Bonjour. Tanse. Good morning. Tawau. Welcome to all of you. So we're going to start the day with Elmer, Ghostkeeper, who accepted to give a blessing this morning. Thank you, Elmer.
Good morning, everybody. Tansikio. Nando, Piogwan, Miogisago, so squats. Samina, Kanagiso mota, the Muhtiak, the Wapachtamak Pisum, a Samina. Utimanas Matsupinokso, Sagasti Nachosche. It's good to meet this day. It's good to walk on Mother Earth. It's good to ride Mother Earth as we go and meet the sun every morning in the east. I'll say a prayer in Michif. Last evening, Nathalie gave me the protocol of a stimao mota. So with that, can I ask you to stand, please? Mamui naftawi mo, igwa kigani no. Aswi tamanana samena, Demi yak, Demi upik squiak, Demi muhtiak, Demi usagatihiak. Mina, en kamitina awama, stimao, Tepihto aik, minasce. Matsigi igwa, Mio asik mina muuta, the pikskuiak muuta, kayas ka nagata skit and stisanan, Harry Daniels, kisoki tako muuta, umuta ka mas naigatik. Matsigi igwa, iguan ma petaba, mama wehtawi mao kigani no, ukse, hai hai.
Thank you, Elmer. So with this blessing, we're going to start the day and with our first panel. So I will ask the panelists to come to the stage and sit at the table, please. Thank you. So while they're getting ready, I'll explain a little bit how it's going to work. Each and every one of them will have 15 to 20 minutes to talk, and then we'll have a period of questions. And we felt that we couldn't start the day without trying to contextualize, you know, the Supreme Court decision, but also the work of Harry Daniels. And so we decided to invite people that have known him and worked with him and were close to him in order to remember that history. And we realize when we look at some of the writings that has been done that there's still a lot that needs to be written on that era, the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. and so much happened, especially when it comes to the recognition of Aboriginal rights and the work that has been done behind it. So I'm sure our four speakers will tell us more about that history and that story. So we'll start with Tony Belcourt. And Tony was born in Lac Sainte-Anne, the Métis community of Lac Sainte-Anne in Alberta. And he has had a distinguished career as a Métis leader and activist. Since being elected vice president of the Métis Association of Alberta in 1970, Mr. Belcourt has played a key role in establishing a national voice for Canada's Métis and non-status Indians. In 1971, he moved to Ottawa as the founding president of the Native Council of Canada. And he worked hard, like he contributed towards the recognition of the Métis in the Constitution Act of 1982 as one of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. And he was also very much involved into continued efforts, constitutional efforts around Meech Lake and Charlottetown. Most recently, he served as president of the Métis Nation of Ontario, an organization that he founded in 1993 and led to prominence until his retirement in May 2008. Throughout his tenure at the MNO, Tony Belcourt was a staunch advocate for the recognition of Métis rights and his efforts to the landmark decision in 2003 of R.V. Pauley in the Supreme Court of Canada. Along the way, he has received numerous awards, and in 1913, he was named an officer of the Order of Canada. So Tony will speak on what brought it on, and did we get what we wanted? Good question. Welcome, Tony Belcourt.
Thank you. Thank you, Elmer, for the prayer this morning. It's beautiful to hear it in our language. I also want to recognize the other elder who is here with us, lifelong friend and sister, Maria Campbell, fellow panelists, fellow Metis. It's great to be here. One of the things that was not said about my bio, and what I like to say now, is that I'm Christy Belcourt's dad. Gabriel told me I could have 2 minutes of his time to tell a story about Harry. I think everybody who knows him should get an opportunity to say something about that wonderful, great guy. We were at Batoche one year, and we were doing the procession on Sunday from the Batoche grounds to the gravesite. And what happens is that people walk along and carrying flags, Métis flags, Canadian flag, and so on. And then there are people on horses and people walking. And so Harry was on a horse right in front, behind the flags, and I was on a horse right behind him, and there were some other people. And it was a really windy day, and those flags were going crazy. And Harry's horse reared up, bang, right on the ground. So he shook himself off, he dusted himself off, and he got back on the horse, and we kept going. Now, I don't know how many people know that Harry was a professional actor and did some films. And I don't know how many people know what an apple is. That's used in Hollywood for short people that can't get on a horse. bring an apple so they can get up on a horse. So we got to the gravesite, and we were all going to get off. And I said, Harry, wait a minute. Just hang on. I jumped off my horse. I said, apple, anybody got an apple? He jumped off. He says, "Catchis, you bugger." Harry was a lot of fun. Very serious guy, and a remarkable guy. And I'm really glad to see that there's a lot of attention being paid to the decision that we now have, and that more people, as we go on and on, are going to learn more and more about this tremendous person. I wanted to talk about how I see Daniels from my perspective when we started to persist to get federal recognition. I want to tell you about how I see it through my lens of a Métis person who grew up in a Métis community, Lac Saint-Anne, Sagahin. The lens of somebody who was active in the Métis Association of Alberta back in the 60s. Lens of somebody who moved to Ottawa, 1971, never been there before. And the lens of somebody who, at the time, when there was no Constitution Act, 1982. That was a decade away. There was no federal recognition of the Treaty on Aboriginal Rights of the Aboriginal peoples, including those of the Métis. That was nearly 50 years ago. When I grew up, we didn't use the term Métis very much in Lac Saint-Anne. We lived just outside the mission grounds. And we go in for Mass and pilgrimage all the time. All I can remember is people were, when they talked about ourselves, we talked about Nehio, Apatago-san. And one thing that was really stuck in my craw all the time was the extent of racism that exists. It was prevalent, and it was heavy, and it was mean. And the poverty that existed. Apparently we were really poor. I didn't recognize we were poor. But my mom told me stories about how if Bill Solberg, the guy living down the road, hadn't given her lard to render, we were going to starve. The goal of my parents was that all of us kids get grade 12 education so we could have a better chance in life. And so we moved into Edmonton. Growing up, I heard about lands, getting our land back. That was one of my dad's favorite topic. Get our land back, son, get our land back. I'd heard this at pilgrimage when people came from all over. In those days, we had thousands of people coming by horseback and buggy, old trucks. And around the campfires at night, you'd hear a lot about people talking about Batosh and having lost, and where's our land? We were supposed to have land for 7 generations. There were some lands that were set aside in the 30s, lands that were called Métis colonies at one time. They're now the Métis settlements. But not everybody could move to those lands, even if they wanted to move to those lands. When I got involved in the 60s, my focus was on Métis rights. I started doing some research on our historic relationship with Canada, and I started doing some reading about the treaties and learned that some of our people had gone up to Slave Lake for Treaty 8 negotiations, and when they got there, they were told, we're only here to have a treaty with the full-bloods. Somebody will come back to have a treaty with the half-breeds. I also saw that federal government had responsibility for, quotes, Indians and lands reserved for Indians. I started learning about the federal division of powers, the powers the provinces have under the Constitution Act 1987, and the powers that the provinces had, or the federal government and the provinces. Federal government has power from mint, the army, taxation, and also Section 91, number 24 on that long list of powers was Indians and lands reserved for Indians. I also saw that in 1939 in a Supreme Court case called Re Eskimos, federal government had taken, Quebec had taken the federal government to court and said those Eskimos up in northern Quebec, up in Gava Bay, they're Indians. They're just like Indians. And federal government, you have the responsibility for them. Well, the Supreme Court agreed. So all of a sudden, I'm finding out federal government had not just responsibility for Indians that we understood as Indians, but also for Eskimos who were not called the Inuit. I knew that we needed to deal with Ottawa when I was vice president of the MMA Métis Association, and I saw that window through 9124. In the late 60s, there were 3 organizations in existence representing Métis and non-status Indians. Late 60s, Métis Association of Alberta, Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, and the Manitoba Métis Federation. I pushed Stan Daniels, who was president of the MMA Métis Association, to get those leaders together. Let's talk about having a presence in Ottawa. So we all agreed, finally, Stan was able to get their agreement to meet in Victoria at the first annual assembly of the BC Association of Non-Status Indians. And we met in a hotel room in Victoria on the evening of November the 16th, 1970. November the 16th being the anniversary of the hanging of Louis Riel. And we decided then that we were going to create an organization and establish an organization and have an office in Ottawa. So we chose an interim committee at the time to lead the preparations and the planning. We chose Jim Sinclair from Saskatchewan as the interim chair, Angus Spence as the vice chair, and me as the secretary. In April of 1971, we got enough money to go to Ottawa, and we had the formation of the founding of the Native Council of Canada. We decided to call it the Native Council of Canada and to represent Métis and non-status Indians. We felt we were in the same boat. In Alberta here, there was an organization called Indian Rights for Indian Women. They were fighting to get their rights back, Jenny Margetts. And, oh, I forgot the names. When you get this white hair, boy, I'm telling you. Métis Association of Alberta made room for non-status Indian women in the membership because they needed a place, they needed a voice. And we figured at the national level that we're going to do that too. So my job when I first got to Ottawa was to organize Métis and non-status Indians all around the rest of the provinces and in the 2 northern territories. That happened very quickly. Although our primary goal was lands for Métis, and that was number 1 for us. Our primary focus in those days was first and foremost to be dealing with the ravages of poverty, discrimination, poor inadequate housing. Our people were living on road allowances, or in the bush, in shacks, no insulation, many times people using oil barrels as stoves, and often we'd hear about a stove exploding somewhere and a house going up in flames, and we were losing people. A lot of our people were moving into the cities. We experienced that here in Edmonton. They were coming here because they wanted to try to get ahead and get a job. When they got here, There was no way a lot of people could get a house. There was just absolutely no housing. People found out, the landlords found out that people, well, they heard their voices or they saw their faces. They said, sorry, we rented the place already. We needed to get Ottawa to pay attention to these needs and to provide programs and services we desperately needed for health, for housing, and for education. As I said, we saw that avenue through 9124. We took the position that we were Indians for the purposes of that act. We said, we're Indians, all of us, for the purposes of the federal government's power to legislate for us and to take our responsibility. And again, I want to emphasize that back in those days, we had absolutely no profile at the national level. Métis were regarded far and wide in Ottawa as having been dealt with and done away with the hanging of Louis Riel. We weren't even a blip on the radar of the national media. Some were aware of Indians because of the white paper policy and the vigorous backlash to that policy led by Harold Cardinal from here. My first job was to create an awareness about who we were and what we were seeking. I spent countless hours with national journalists who scoffed at us. They said, you don't look native enough. It was horrible. Only full-blooded Indians, as they call them, counted in their view. Bureaucrats stiff-armed us and told us to go see the provinces. We were able to, fortunately, get core funding shortly after I moved to Ottawa, thanks to the efforts of Bob Stanbury, who was the Undersecretary of State at the time. In those days, there was a policy called federal, but Pierre Trudeau put this policy in called participatory democracy. And we said, well, who needs it more than us? So we were able to get some federal core funding. And with that, we used it to organize. We produced brochures. We started a tabloid called The Forgotten People. And in time, I was able to get to meet with ministers, including Jean Chrétien, who was Minister of Indian Affairs in Northern Alberta, Indian and Northern Affairs. I want to tell you that about when I first got there and wanting to meet the Minister of Indian Affairs. There was no way I could meet with him. When I first got there, I wanted to meet with George Manuel. The National Indian Brotherhood had recently been set up a couple of years ahead of us and had set up an office. And when I finally was able to get a meeting with George, it was over coffee. George said, Tony, nobody wants me to meet with you. Chiefs don't want me to meet with you. Indian Affairs doesn't want me to meet with you. They're all saying, don't meet with that guy. Don't meet with those people, because if you do, you know what's going to happen. There's only a loaf of bread here, George, in Ottawa for Indians. And if they get recognized, they're going to have to start taking some of those loaves of bread, so some of that bread away from you. And I said, George, Ottawa is not a loaf of bread. Ottawa is a bakery. And you're not getting your fair share. And we're not getting anything. We submitted briefs, and eventually the media started paying some attention to us. Getting into being recognized under 9124 was the theme of our first written brief to Federal Cabinet Minister Gerard Pelletier, who was Secretary of State. We needed somebody to be an advocate for us in Cabinet. We felt he'd be the best guy. We certainly weren't going to be able to get Indian Affairs, nor did we want to. We didn't want to start creating any impression that we were trying to become Indians under the Indian Act and come in under Indian and Northern Affairs. Non-status Indian people wanted their status back. That's a different thing, but not for the Métis. The other thing was they had just announced a policy program for culture, and it was going to be handled by Indian and Northern Affairs. We knew what would happen because every program going through Indian and Northern Affairs was only available to status Indians. We knew we'd never be able to access them. So we wanted Peltier to become the minister responsible, taking the lead for us in any programs and services to be argued through him. I want to read from that opening paragraph, that submission, the opening paragraph, which reads, "We speak to you, Mr. Minister, as the representative of the non-status Indian and Métis people of Canada, who number in excess of 400,000 Canadians, all of whom are of Indian ancestry. In the eyes of the dominant society, we are Indians because, for the most part, we look like Indians, think like Indians, live like Indians, and have a value system that is characteristic of the Indian way of life. We are desperately poor with levels of ill health, inadequate housing, unemployment, and poverty that are a disgrace in the Western world." We went on to say, "When this country was put together more than 100 years ago, there were not artificial legalistic definitions as to who was native and who was not. The first parliament in Canada in 1868 recognized the existence of Indian people, which included all persons of Indian ancestry who were living an Indian way of life, who chose to remain such, and all their descendants." That's chapter 42, S15 of the Statutes of Canada, 1868, and I'm told I only have 5 minutes left. Does that include the 2 minutes Gab gave me? I won't bother reading any more from the quote. There's a lot. I'm just going to bypass it all. Suffice it to say, we were making our point over and over again in about 13 single-spaced pages of our brief. We did talk a lot about the programs and services that we needed. And although we wanted to have those programs and services made directly available to us under Section 9124, we also took advantage of the fact that the federal government had programs and services for Canadians generally. So we went after them. And that included programs and services for communications, for friendship centers. In response to our housing needs, for example, we convinced Canada Mortgage and Housing to set up 2 very important policies. One of them was called the Rural and Native Housing Policy, and the other was the Urban Native Housing Policy, which made it possible for projects like Canative here in Edmonton and in Calgary. The federal government never accepted any legal or legislative responsibility for us, not during my time, nor those of my successors, including the late Harry Daniels. Not even after we were included in the Constitution Act 1982, where our rights were clearly recognized. The federal government, as we found out in the Powley case, as with all the provinces, took the position that even though our rights were recognized in the Constitution, they said that they were either never existing or that they were extinguished. So we didn't have any rights. So 9124 wasn't going to matter to us anyway. We continued to be excluded from any processes to address Métis land settlements. In time, as we know, Harry had no choice but to go to court. Took the federal government to court, and did we succeed and did we get what we want? Not yet, but the opportunity is there. Audrey Putra last night told us about the fact that the federal government is signing an MOU with the Métis Association of Alberta within the coming days, and that they're going to, on that MOU, on the agenda for negotiations, is land and self-government. That's fantastic. "50 years ago, I felt strongly that one day we would get recognized. I had no idea what that was going to look like in the end. But I really felt strongly that we were going to get there." Harry Daniels and the Daniels decision is a critical catalyst for us eventually getting what we want. Thank you, Harry. Merci.
Thank you very much, Tony. I'll have to remember to tell my students when I'm teaching that Ottawa is a bakery, not a loaf of bread. Our next presenter is Elmer Ghostkeeper. Elmer Ghostkeeper was homeborn on the Paddle Prairie Métis settlement. He was educated in Paddle Prairie and Fairview, Alberta, and completed his post-secondary education in civil engineering, technology, NAIT, and bachelor and master's degrees in cultural anthropology and political science at the University of Alberta, Edmonton. His thesis was published into a book, Spirit Gifting, the Concept of Spiritual Exchange. And I know at the Faculty of Native Studies we use your book a lot. His thesis was published into a book. I said that already, I'm sorry. Elmer was elected as a councillor and chairman of Paddle Prairie Métis Settlements at the age of 27 years and president of the Alberta Federation of Métis Settlement Associations at the age of 33 years in 1980. From 1980 to 1982, Elmer was involved in the repatriation process of the Constitution of Canada and was one of the Métis leaders to successfully negotiate Métis as one of 3 Aboriginal peoples of Canada and entrenched their existing Aboriginal and treaty rights in Section 35. Elmer moved to the Buffalo Lake Métis settlement in 2005, self-built a home, and was elected to the council from 2007 to 2010, and again in 2013, and retired and resigned from council in 2016. Elmer continues to be active as a consultant and volunteers for national and local community service organizations. He continues to have a passion for securing Metisland in Section 35, Constitution of Canada Act 1982. And Elmer will be talking about threading the constitutional needle with Sinew of Metisland and Métis Nation. Please welcome Elmer Ghostkeeper.
Thanks very much, Nathalie. Good morning, elders, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President Gerald Cunningham of the Métis Settlements General Council, and other elected leaders. There's quite a few that are recognized here today, and you, the audience, ladies and gentlemen, as well as the elder Maria that just left for a short while, and my fellow panelists. As a young Métis leader I had the opportunity to break also into national politics, and the late Harry was my mentor. He had come to Alberta with the Native Council of Canada to hold hearings on Métis Aboriginal rights, and invited me to co-chair one of the hearings on the Kikino Métis settlement. And Harry and I really hit it off. From there, he invited me to accompany the Native Council of Canada to New Zealand. We visited the Maori and their government. They've got 12 elected guaranteed seats in their parliament in New Zealand, and they're a third of the people. We stayed on a marae, and then from there was a World Council of Indigenous Peoples meeting in Australia. Harry was also on that, if not maybe the vice chair of that forum. And then the Aborigine invited us to go on an outback tour to look at their conditions. And then from there, I became more and more involved in national politics, provincial politics, working on Métis to be recognized as an Aboriginal people. The title of my talk is Nathalie introduced, is Threading the Constitutional Needle with Sinew of Metisland and Métis Nation government. And our theme is Daniels in context. It's quite a challenge to do the research, to do the hard work, to write the paper in such a manner that it doesn't become too legalistic, but at the same time, it tells a story. During the late 1920s and early 1930s in Alberta, the Métis population, 2 generations after many of their forefathers had defended their land and government at the Battle of Batoche, Saskatchewan, were once again confronted by the federal government. The federal government had unilaterally disbanded the St. Paul Métis colony in 1909, and in 1930 had transferred the natural resources to the province of Alberta. Métis had not been consulted and accommodated. Many found their families and extended families living on road allowances and public lands, and poor housing and health conditions, and no schools and work. Natural-born Métis leaders began to organize the Métis. They held summer gatherings and conferences to discuss, strategize, and plan demands for a Métis land reserve, a Métis Nation government for the improvement of their cultural, social, and economic conditions. What emerged in 1932 was fanning the flames, fanning the embers of a dormant Métis nationalism in a government into the collective voice, the Association. It became a force to be reckoned with by the provincial government. It was legally registered, and the executive were legally represented, as well as the board members, and they created a collective constitution, and central to it was a demand for a Métis land reserve, a government, and economic and social goals, then sent their demands to the provincial government of lands and minerals in 1933. The provincial government responded in 1934 to the demands to the Métis demands by establishing the Ewing Commission and holding meetings with Lee Association executive and organizing separate Métis conferences in northern Alberta. My late father and his two brothers heard about the provincial government's Ewing Commission, the planned establishment of a Métis Reserve, and meetings to be held at High Prairie in northwestern Alberta. They had ridden on horseback to scout for a suitable Métis land reserve gifted with natural resources and water for farming, ranching, logging, hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering. They located 21 townships of unoccupied Crown land at Kig River and hired a truck at Notikewin to take them to the High Prairie meeting. There they gave an oral presentation on their selected land location in Bushland, Cree, Michif, and English to the Royal Commissioners. As a child, home birthed and raised on the Keg River Colony No. 1, while playing under the family kitchen table, I often heard my late father tell this historical story in Bushland, Cree, and Michif to Métis men who had come for a tea and bannock meeting. His brothers and he had successfully negotiated a reserved land for the establishment of a colony and understood it to be their Métis land to use, occupy, and make a living working with the land. My father said he was asked by the commissioners if they found gold, coal, and other minerals, who would own the subsurface resources? His answer was the Métis would be both the owners of what is above and below the ground. He said the commissioners accepted his answer, and in my early years, his stories were embedded in my memory and greatly influenced me to enter Métis politics at 27. Between the years of 1934 and 1936, the Ewing Royal Commissioners continued to hold Métis conferences to elicit and negotiate recommendations for lands to be set aside for Métis settlement. Then the province held a provincial election, and the United Farmers Party, currently in power, was defeated by the Social Credit Party, who took over governing Alberta. The Social Credit government finally accepted the Ewing Royal Commission's recommendations, and in 1938 passed the Métis Population Betterment Act. The preamble to the Métis Population Betterment Act states, and I quote, "Whereas by the report dated the 15th day of February 1936, a commission appointed pursuant to the Public Inquiries Act on the 27th day of February 1933, certain recommendations were made for the betterment of the general welfare of the Métis population of the province. And whereas it is convenient and in the public interest that the ways and means of giving effect to such recommendations should be arrived at by means of conferences and negotiations between the government of Alberta and representatives of the Métis population of the province. Therefore, His Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, enacts as follows. This Act may be cited as the Métis Population Betterment Act. The Act continues on to say, this Act formulating one or more schemes for the purpose of bettering the general welfare of the Métis population on land set aside for that purpose by the province. Is then the Métis Population Betterment Act 1938 a Métis treaty and the setting aside of unoccupied provincial crown lands a Métis reserve? A Canadian treaty negotiated with the Crown, federally or provincially is the same Crown, is an agreement between two peoples, one Indigenous nation and one non-Indigenous nation, in exchange for rights that sit in promises, obligations, and benefits for both peoples. This is the English definition. People to people negotiate treaties, and the final agreement is a paper document. The Cree word for treaty is Ogamau Wichiwa Gun Yusotum Hitowin. And the meaning could be translated as the Leaders' Partnership Promise Agreement. Métis leaders begin meetings, conferences, partnerships, agreements, feasts, gatherings, etc., with an opening and closing prayer, said in Cree or Michif by a respected elder. This protocol is a natural Métis law and gives a blessing to legitimize the events. Negotiations are conducted in both English and in both Cree and English, and the final treaty partnership agreement is written in English. Through the process of translation, much of the meaning of the Cree words are lost because most of the words are verbs. Cree is a living, breathing, moving oral language, and prayers give a blessing of life, in this case, to a written partnership agreement, the treaty. The Métis Population Betterment Act of 1938 set aside 12 areas of negotiated Métis land reserves in northeastern and northwestern Alberta. To this day, 8 Métis settlements, Métis land, exists, and 4 were rescinded by the province without consultation and accommodation. I currently live on the Buffalo Lake Métis settlement. Lake First Nations treaties and reserves pursuant to the Indian Act, British North America Act, Section 9124, and the Métis Population Betterment Act of 1938 is a statutory right of using and occupying and working with Métis reserves to make a living, which was granted to the Métis population as a constructive title by the government. However, there exists a Métis interest and inherent right in Métis and the Métis land. Rights are inherent, alive, in the people that exercise them. The Métis had not given up any rights. The provincial government gained responsibility for the general welfare of the Métis as citizens of the province. Both had benefited. In my humble opinion, yes, the Métis Population Betterment Act of 1938 is a legally binding negotiated Métis treaty that set aside Métis land reserves and a Métis Nation government. The Betterment Act satisfies both the English and Cree definitions of a treaty. A sacred agreement of partnership promises, obligations, and benefits. It was negotiated by the means of conferences and negotiations with His Majesty the Crown. by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of the Province of Alberta, a non-Indigenous nation government, and with the association, a Métis Nation government recognized as such by His Majesty the Crown. The Métis Population Betterment Act of 1938 was an existing Alberta Provincial Act in 1982. At the time, Section 35 of the Constitution Act of Canada, 1982, was negotiated into power as the highest Canadian law. I was blessed and fortunate to be a young Métis leader in Alberta, duly elected by the Alberta Federation of Métis Settlement Associations to negotiate Métis as an Aboriginal people with recognized and existing Aboriginal and treaty rights between 1980 and 82. Section 35 simply states, Section 35(3) simply states, treaty rights includes rights that now exist by way of land claim agreements or may be so acquired. Section 35 applies equally both to females and males. It is also my humble opinion that the Métis Population Betterment Act of 1938 exists in Section 35 as a recognized and affirmed Métis land claim agreement. This Métis land reserve is the only constitutionally protected Métis land base in Canada. The Daniels Supreme Court of Canada's decision clarified that Métis are Indians within Section 9124 and under federal jurisdiction. This ruling does not mean Métis are Indians culturally or otherwise. Métis remain as a distinct Aboriginal people with distinct Aboriginal and treaty rights. The decision does not invalidate Métis provincial legislation and confirms the Crown owes a fiduciary duty to Métis and the right to be consulted and accommodated. Yes, Daniels was possibly a victory and possibly not. I had some reservations about Daniels because there's three sections of power within the Canadian Constitution. Section 35 is Aboriginal powers. Section 91 is federal powers, and Section 92 is provincial powers. Section 35 says there's three Aboriginal peoples, Indian, Inuit, and Métis. When we negotiated that, there was an attempt to define Métis, and we said no. You're not going to define Indian or Inuit. Métis shouldn't be defined either. So it's not defined in the highest law of the land. There's no question we know who we are. And so Daniels, in context then, relative to Métis living on Métis land in Alberta, has opened the federal Crown door to negotiate and confirm, threading the constitutional needle with Sinew of Métis land and Métis Nation government as an existing, recognized and affirmed Métis Aboriginal land claim. In my mind, it was completed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elmer. So we're going from politics to more personal testimonies about Harry Daniels. And we're very happy to have Gabriel Daniels with us today. Gabriel was born in Ottawa, Ontario, to Harry Daniels and Linda Fisher, both Métis from Saskatchewan, and Gabriel was raised primarily by his mother in Edmonton, alongside his brother Conway and sister Chantal. Métis culture was an important part of their upbringing, and after Harry passed away, Gabriel symbolically took his father's place in the Daniels case in order for it to continue. Gabriel has lived across central and western Canada and has worked in various industries, including television and film. Now living in Winnipeg with his wife, Amy, Gabriel works as a carpenter and actor and is delighted to be the father of two young daughters, Malaya and Mara. Gabriel credits what he learned from his parents for making it possible for him to hold his head high as a proud member of the Métis Nation. And Gabriel the title of his talk is Harry Daniels and the Daniels Case, a son's perspective on the man, his legacy, and vision for a united Métis Nation. Please welcome Gabriel Daniels.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I normally don't do a lot of public speaking, so I'm going to be kind of all over the place. I haven't written anything down, but I'd like to acknowledge everyone here on the panel, some very dear friends of my father, and my mother and my sister. Glad that I can see them here in town. As you were saying, I live in Winnipeg. Actually, where I live in Winnipeg right now, it's the River Heights area, and that's where the Grant Park Mall is. I can't remember the name of that area at the time, but that's where Métis people used to live in that area, and they were pushed out. And I live where they were, so I don't know. I always think that's kind of anyway. About my father, I guess if you knew him, like any stories I tell you, any words I have, it doesn't do its justice. He was a larger than life figure. I was very proud of him. But I have to say though, as a young man, not growing up with him, I was always angry, had an anger that I didn't get the time with him that I wanted as a son. So as life went on, as I got to be an adult, I learned and accepted that he had to be the way he was to do what he achieved. And you know, what he did in '82, getting the Métis in the Constitution, I know he always felt, as proud as he was of it, he always felt it was incomplete. Like it wasn't, like, yeah, we were recognized as a people, but we weren't in 91-24. So I know that always bothered him. So when he passed, and I got a call to fill in for him, it was an easy, very easy decision, because I knew what it meant to him, and I knew what it meant to uniting our people. And uniting our people, I think, is, in my opinion, is at a very sad state, because we have some Métis, I'm not saying all Métis, some Métis who, and it's my personal opinion as well, that we have all these mixed blood people all across the country, and I don't feel, if they're not from the Red River, then we cannot exclude them to being in our club, because we came from nothing. So to tell others that they're not welcome to be with us, Because I was flipping through this, and there's some scholars. I'm not a scholar. Like you said, I'm a carpenter. I'm an actor. Everyone's got opinions. Everyone's a genius nowadays, and that's fine. But if we're not focusing on uniting, like the government does a good enough job trying to keep us apart, we don't need to do the work for them. So, anyhow, I'm not gonna use up my whole 20 minutes. Yeah, I don't even know. I should have wrote stuff down, but I don't know. I'm proud of my father, and to all you critics who are against the case, you know what? I do want to say something. When I went down to the Supreme Court for the hearing, the thing that pissed me off, that our own people are there intervening it. Like, I don't know. Is it money? Is that what the problem is? Like, is it, oh man, there's going to be not enough money for everybody? Like, if that's your mentality, then get the hell out of here and go do something else. Because if you're not in it for all of us, and you're not in it for the betterment of all of our people, then I don't even want to talk to you. I don't want to know you. I don't want you to represent us. Like, I'm a carpenter. I'll make my own money. I don't care. I'll get my own way. Sorry, I'm a little emotional. I just, every time I talk about my dad, I get this way. So, thank you for having me.
Can I ask you?
Yeah. How did my name get on the court case? Yeah. It was Dale Gibson who called me, and he said, "Look, your dad died." I was like, "Yeah." He said, the Daniels case, it's happening, and I knew him and Dwight were talking about it back in the day, but I didn't know how far it was, and I didn't even know he filed it. Actually, I remember him talking about it, but anyway, he called me and said, "Look, we need you or someone, if it isn't you, to take his place." So I was like, okay, and then he told me about the case. I'm like, oh yeah, for sure, man. If it's about bringing people together and completing, getting us in the Constitution, then to fulfill my dad's legacy, then yes, absolutely. Logically, for me, anything that makes sense in terms of negotiating for land or bringing people together, I'm all for it. And I do want to say one other thing to the critics and the other politicians who don't agree with my father's vision. And that's fine. But like I said, I don't want anything from anybody. I make my own living. I don't care. But what I do want from my father is his rightful place, to be up there alongside Louis. That's what I want. And I guarantee you, if Harry and Louis were here with me, they would agree that we're more than the Red River. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. And thank you for taking the time to come here and be with us. Thank you. So our last presenter of this panel is Maria Campbell. She is a writer, playwright, filmmaker, and researcher. She has published 6 books. Her first book, Half Breed, was published in 1973 and continues to be a popular seller. Her last book, Stories of the Road Allowance People, was republished in 2009 by the Gabriel Daniels Publishing in Saskatoon. She is currently co-editing a book with Kim Anderson and Christy Belcourt, which will be published in 2018 by the University of Alberta Press. So we're looking forward to this. Maria is the cultural advisor for the Center for World Indigenous Knowledge and Research at Athabasca University, Edmonton, Alberta, and for the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. Maria has been a volunteer for over 40 years with women and children in crisis, and her home has been a safe house for many years. She is a founding member of Grandmothers for Justice Council and is one of the grandmothers working with the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women Commission. She has received many awards and honors, among them Officer of the Order of Canada, a National Aboriginal Achievement Award, Saskatchewan Order of Merit, and she has inducted in the Saskatchewan Theatre Hall of Fame. She has just completed a 3-year Trudeau Fellowship at the University of Ottawa and has researched the history of violence against Indigenous women and children in the 17th century. Maria is a mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. So please welcome Maria Campbell.
I'll try not to cry. I'm one of those weepers. I'm really honored to be at this conference and to speak about my brother and friend, Harry Daniels. He was such a crazy, beautiful man who loved conferences that were full of laughter, passion, and politics. And if he was the center of all that, he loved it even better. So you can be sure he's here today, just pacing around at the back of the room, making jokes, getting pissed off, agreeing, disagreeing, and debating with us. He loved to debate, and believe me, you'd better be a good critical thinker if you were spending time with him, or a really good drinker. I can see him walking in. Later in his life, he'd probably have been wearing a $1,000 pinstriped suit, looking like an old 1930s outlaw. But back in the 1960s, he would have walked in with his neatly pressed blue jeans, cowboy boots, all polished and shiny, and his black hair tipped back just so on top of his long curly hair. His sash knotted and hanging in front like a breechcloth. Old style, he used to say, not like some tenderfoot Anglais posing as a breed. And he really did say that once to somebody. Harry loved words like midshif and half-breed because they made white people uncomfortable, and they made some of his people squirm in embarrassment. He probably would have come in doing a little sidestepping Red River jig. Harry loved showing off. Like everybody who knew him, I have many stories about our early days, all of us, and many of you are here today, as young organizers and, quote, revolutionaries of the Métis movement. That's the language of the 60s, but those are stories for another time. I just want to share one with you. I was the elected secretary-treasurer of the newly organized or reorganized Métis Association of Alberta from 1964 to, 1969. I can't remember the date. And for those of you who don't remember, my name was June Stifel, my middle name and my married name. I started using my first name and my family name when I published Half-Breed in 1973. I was also the director of field workers, as they were called back then, but really we were just organizers with starvation wages. and mostly we were working with no money. People like the late Henry Houle and Richard Patra, who, by the way, as many of you know, was a direct descendant of Louis Riel's sister, and his kinship to Riel was our claim to fame when we traveled into communities. When we were out traveling, it was really important who your friends were and who your family was. And so when we'd come into communities, we'd say, you know, Richard is a descendant of Louis Riel's sister. And we'd get grub, free food, get a place to stay, and we'd be treated really good. There was also Clara Yellowknee, there was Frances Dufresne, there was lots of others, I can't remember their names right now. But we were the people who went out into the communities and organized. Right now, I can't remember all those names. That happens to us when we start getting old. I'm not really old yet, I'm just starting. We all worked under the mentorship of the late Adrian Hope, old Henry Thompson, and Henry White. Adrian was from Kikino and Henry from Lac La Biche, and at that time Henry White was living here. These were some really amazing old men. Adrian, for instance, you know, was a storyteller, an oral historian. He was the keeper of a whole lot of political knowledge. He was also an old bronc rider, and there were so many things that he did. I remember one story about him in particular. He told us that he was always telling us when we were driving around these stories. He said the old Métis Association had no money, and they used to travel around on horseback in the winter. They'd have to eat frozen bannock and rabbits, and they'd organize people. And he said one day they needed money, and there was a little rodeo going on in some town, so he went and signed up. Of course, he got bucked off, and he said that was why he had a bum leg. I don't know if that's a true story or not, but we were really impressed by it. Old Henry Thompson was one of those old people who was like he wanted everything written down, and he had I don't know how many scribblers and stenographers' notebooks, and he took meticulous notes, and he always did them in Cree-syllabics. And so he would tell us, you've got to make sure you keep track of everything so that it can go in the archives, and someday our young people can read that stuff. I often wonder what happened to all of his notepads. Adrian and Henry, the two Henrys, were young organizers in the 1930s, and they were intellectuals, although we never used that word back then. But I realize today that's what they were. They were well-read, they were articulate, and they were politically astute. They were mentored by Jim Brady, Malcolm Norris, Henry Tompkins, and Joseph Dion, who were also educated, articulate, and very, very radical. These were the men who, along with their people, were responsible for the birth of the Métis settlements, or the colonies as they were called then, the only land that was ever allotted to our people since 1885. To make a long story short, I was fired from my job by the president, the late president, Stan Daniels, no relation of Harry's. I learned this when I arrived one morning to my cubbyhole office, and this man in a fringed buckskin jacket was sitting on my chair, his feet on my desk, and he was talking on my phone. My stuff was piled up in a cardboard box by the door. When he saw me, he hung up the phone, and I asked, "Who the hell are you?" And without missing a beat, he jumped up, and fringes flying, his hand at his waist, he made a big bow, and he said, "Gabriel Dumas, and I've come to lead your revolution." That was how I met Harry Daniels. I was fired, and he got my job. When he found this out, he felt really bad. Not bad enough, of course, to give me my job back, but bad enough that he shared his wages with me until I found work again. Harry was a really generous and kind man. Listening to Gabriel talking, I got really emotional. You know, it's hard enough being a leader, in our organization anyway. I'm sure it is for anybody else, but ours is one of the meanest ones and the toughest ones in the country, and you've got to have a heart of steel to be able to survive it. But it's even harder on families, and I really feel that we owe Harry's family a huge debt of gratitude. We can never repay them for the things that they've had to give up, and I just want us to acknowledge that. Gabriel is here, Chantel is here, and Linda is here. When Harry and Linda got married, they were really poor, and I was even poorer, but I had an old blue station wagon, and so that's what they used to go on their honeymoon. There was a big hole in the back seat, and I remember putting a piece of plywood to cover that hole so that in case they picked somebody up on the road, they wouldn't fall through. As I said, Harry was a kind and generous man. He shared everything he had, which was not very much. He had lots of hats, books, and art, but not much of anything else except the stories he left behind. My dad was a storyteller, and he once said about people like Harry, "Them kinds of mans, they're different from the rest of us, and the people that tell stories about them forever." He would say, loosely translated, when they leave something with us. Who knows what, but they leave something. And for sure they become sacred relatives, and we remember them with stories, and our telling of those stories keep us grounded and one with this sacred homeland. So when I was invited to speak about him today, I decided to talk about that word, Kichwagochtowin. It's an old word. No one uses it anymore, but it speaks to the sacredness of kinship, of family, of homeland. And it is the foundational and fundamental teaching of all our laws, our traditions, our principles, and our values. Without Kichwagochtowin, we are not and can never be a nation in any way except in empty words on paper. It will never happen in this place where our spirit dwells. Perhaps Louis Riel said it best when he said, "God cannot create a tribe without locating it. We are not birds, we have to walk on the ground." And Kichwagochtowin is about walking on the ground. We must walk on our own land. And I'm sure that the people who live on settlements can attest to that, and especially those people who are gone now, but remember what it was like the first time that they were able to go onto those settlements and know that this was a place that they would be able to leave their generations forever. On Wednesday, I visited with Murray Hamilton in Saskatoon, something I do when I'm really feeling blue or I want to get politically aroused or completely pissed off. He's somebody you should invite to these meetings, along with a lot of other people, in particular women. By the way, it's great to see Audrey and Margaret leading their nations. And I just want to tell you that I ran for president of Alberta once. Remember that, Tony? What a year that was. Oh man, I was really sure I was going to win. Everybody was so supportive and wonderful. Well, I got 8 votes and one of them was mine. Even my brothers didn't vote for me. But I was elected Secretary-Treasurer by acclamation. Back to Murray Hamilton. He was never an elected leader when we think of leaders like Harry, politicians who were up front. Rather, he was a community leader. More importantly, he was the confidant and friend of the leaders, and in particular, a friend of Harry's. Murray is also an oral historian and knowledge keeper who knows so much stuff it's scary. I almost feel like locking him up and shaking the stories out of him. Although he would probably resort to mayhem if he were here and heard me say that, and I'm sure he's listening on whatever it is that we're streaming today. He was not only Harry's good friend, he was also a friend of all of those old guys and was privileged to their stories. But he's a curmudgeon and can be a real old fart sometime and will tell you he knows nothing. But he's a traditional Michif. Give him a pouch of tobacco and a yard of ribbon and ask him to share the stories with you. He will. Anyway, I met with him and we had a bowl of soup, and I told him I was coming here. We talked for a while. We got a bit teary-eyed about our brother and old times. And we talked about land. You know, Tony talked about land. That was what it was about when our people were fighting in Red River, when they were fighting in Batoche, when they were organizing here and across the country over the years. I remember as a little girl, like Elmer, growing up and sitting under the table listening in a little Rhode Island community where I grew up, listening to our old people talking about we have to get land. And I remember working with all of those old people in the 1960s, and that was what they told us young people: we have to get land. And when the leaders were elected, that's what they were sent away to do. They had to get us land. We never talked about identity and all of those kinds of things. I realize those are important, and that's not what I'm here to talk about. And I just want to say that what is wrong with many tribes? You know, there's Métis from Red River. What's wrong with Métis from someplace else? It's okay for every other Indigenous nation in this country to have dialects and to have different territories that they belong to. Why do we have to be the way that we are? You know, why does somebody have to tell me that I'm not Michif and I don't speak Michif because I speak Cree? Most of the old men that I worked with spoke Cree first, and they considered themselves Indians, not Indians in the way that we think in white man's terms, because that's how most of us think. We were Indians in that we were people of this land, and that's what that meant. My father called himself an Indian, but he always said, I'm Michif, I'm a half-breed, after. And he meant that he had always lived off the land. And there's a whole different thing. When people start thinking and having all of these discussions, they're thinking in colonial Western terms, and that's what we have to stop doing, because otherwise we're never going to have anything. Like the old people say, a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. So finally, coming back to this, I said to Murray, you've got to help me do this. You know I can talk too much and I only have 15 minutes. So in a nutshell, how can I explain what Harry was doing when he filed this case? Because he used to talk about it all the time. Murray is a closet poet, and he would come up with, and he still can, the most perfect quotes. This is what he said. Harry wanted to finish the work Riel started in 1870 that was to determine what the relationship would be between Métis and the Canadian state. Harry often spoke of a Métis treaty, and recent developments have proven him correct once again. And it's really sad that he's not here to negotiate for us. Rest in peace, bro. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you to all of you for coming to the conference and telling your stories. So we're going to open the floor for questions or comments.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Lauren Lattiser from Buffalo Lake Métis Settlement. And I'm really happy to be here today to meet Harry Daniels' son. because I was telling him that his dad used to live with us. I was a young guy when he was there, like 12-year-old kid. And my brother Earl, if you knew him, he was a big guy, and him and Harry were real good friends. Like Harry, like more or less was a big brother to me. Because the day my brother got killed in Lac La Biche, Harry Daniels consoled me. Like it was like a big brother, like I said. And I never knew much about Louis Riel back then. I was just a kid, but now when you speak on it, and what I learned about it as I grew up, that's who they were like, a Louis Riel. They had big hearts filled with love and compassion. They never turned nobody away. And I really respect well-educated people, but I also have great respect for people like the young Daniels here, who says it the way it is. We are all Métis. It doesn't just go from the red Manitoba going this way. My grandfathers come from Quebec, and that's how our Métis started, from the French and the Indian. So no matter where you're at, if you got Indian in your blood and European, you are Métis. And the way I see it, it's always the white government that try to weaken us by taking our numbers away and making us fight within our own Métis communities. And I got the same set of ways like Mr. Daniels spoke about. I am a Métis. I am not here for the money, and I will not turn on my people for any monies. Thank you.
I would just like.
No, you can, I think.
You hear me? Oh, okay. Yeah, and I just want to expand on what I said, is that, you know, we can't just pigeonhole ourselves to, in my opinion, regionally. And we also got to be careful, though. Like, if someone really has to be truly a mixed blood person, because we got to be careful, like those Joseph Boyens will come in, like, hey, wearing a buckskin jacket and playing the part. So I just wanted to expand on what I said and respond to you a little bit there. So, thank you.
Yeah, but like I mentioned, if you got the North American Indian blood here and European blood, you are Métis.
Yeah.
But you gotta have that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Good morning. Tanse. My name is Dan Cardinal. I am an elected leader. I'm vice president with Region 1. And I guess I asked a friend, I don't know if I want to ask this question, and I don't know if it's a question for you or for lawyers, but the question is, what does Section 9124 mean for the Métis people? I've asked that question, and you hear different answers. And yeah, it's wonderful to have a panel, and it's wonderful that we have educated people. And I feel I myself am not a fool. I've gone to college, I've been at this university, but my question that I hear from people up north is, Section 9124. What exactly does it mean for our people? That's the question I would like to ask you, and if I can get an answer.
It's one thing to be recognized by the federal government as being a Canadian citizen who is poor and needs services, and so you get job training money or you get special housing programs and things like that. It's one thing to do that, but it's another thing for the federal government to say we recognize you as a people, and that there is some outstanding business concerning you. We have to deal with you about that. And land is number one. Audrey Patra, your president, said last night that the federal government is going to be signing a memorandum of understanding with the Métis Association of Alberta for negotiations. One of those things is going to be on the agenda is going to be land. The other is self-government. Federal government is now giving money to do work on registries, so that when they negotiate, they know who they're negotiating with. It's going to lead, maybe not in my time or ours, to some things happening where land is concerned. But at least it's going to start. That's the biggest thing, I think. There's all kinds of other things I think that are important, but it's the most important to say, we're going to recognize you now in a different way than we ever did before. We're going to say the federal government does in fact have the right and the authority to make legislation where you're concerned, whereas before they said no.
Can I just add to that, Tony? Is this on?
I think it.
Hello? Okay, there we go. Now, when my father was dying on his deathbed, we were talking, and he said, you know, Gabriel, I've done a lot of things politically, but said one thing we got that I wanted to fight for is land. So when you ask, what does this mean, getting in 9124, that's what it means. Now we have, the feds can't just not talk to us. No, they have to. They legally have to talk to us. And that's the one thing, like what Tony was saying, that land, everyone's getting rich off the fat of the land, and that's whatever, but, so I just want to add to the answer.
Good morning. My name is Kim Bowden. I'm the Vice Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. I'm actually enjoying the conversation so far. It's really, really good. It's informative. One of the things that I noticed, though, is that I'm wondering about non-status Indians. That's sort of been left off the table. Harry Daniels had fought for that as well. I know of various bands that were wiped out here, for example, in Alberta. Papa Chase, Calahoo, the Michelle Band, gobs and, huge tracts of land taken away. The issue that really bothers me is that those people are somewhat forgotten. I mean, there was a term this morning about the forgotten people. Tony mentioned it when in 1971 when CAP was born, or excuse me, Native Council was born, and it morphed into CAP. And then one of the things that was also discussed too was regards to the division. And you touched on it, Gabriel. You're talking about the political foes that are out there, and it was interesting because Tony referred to it this morning, a little earlier, about AFN, not meeting with them, the loaf of bread. I mean, it was interesting. I believe that we can't forget about non-status Indians in this country, and that's why we're here, and that's why I'm hoping we can do even more. All right, thank you.
Well, as someone who once represented non-status Indians, I guess it's fair for me to respond a bit to that. I'll respond this way. I've been involved ever since I was here in Alberta, and when I moved to Ottawa, on the strength of by the way, of a $5,000 loan from the Métis Association of Alberta. That was the first money the Native Council ever had to set up our office. Ever since then, and even today, I'm still involved. I'm a councillor for the Ottawa Region Métis Council. So I've stayed active. And in the 70s, we formed an organization in Ontario called the Ontario Métis and Non-Status Indian Association. It eventually changed its name to the Ontario Métis and Aboriginal Association. In the late 90s, or the early 90s, we'd go to meetings, we'd have 500 people at the meeting, and half of the room would all be wanting to talk about non-status Indian issues. And the other half of the room were all the people that want to talk about Métis issues. And we were fighting just to get on the agenda. And so those of us who were on the board of that organization at the time, who were the Métis, we proposed that the organization be split in two. One, we said, look, we're going to have one for the Métis people to look at Métis rights, Métis issues, those things that are important to us. And we said, to those who identify as non-status Indians, you do the same thing. You've got different issues. You want to deal, at the time those people wanted to deal with Indian affairs as Indians and getting recognized by Indian affairs as Indians. And we said, you've got to organize and do that for yourselves. We went on, and I think all across the land Métis organizations have established their legitimacy to the point that the federal government is saying, we're going to deal with the Métis now. The Métis organization, Métis representative bodies on issues concerning land, because your legitimacy is very clear. For non-status Indian people, I think they've got to do the same thing. I think non-status Indian people have to be clear about who it is they are, who they represent, what it is they want, establish their own arguments, and go forward on the basis of that. And when we do something and non-status Indians do something or First Nations do something, as Gabriel said, we're all in this together. We should be supporting each other. We should be helping each other along the way. And not fighting for each other, against each other. Because that's not what it's about. It's about, as Indigenous people, what is rightfully ours, and what we want to leave for future generations. So we work together to help each other. But we have to be clear about who it is we are, what we want, who we represent, and establish our legitimacy.
I'm going to attempt to answer that too. I think that's a very good question. After Section 35, well, initially the Aboriginal section was 34. And the first ministers dropped it because in favor of an amending formula. 7 of the 10 provinces that constituted 50% of the Canadian population could amend the Constitution. And they dropped it because they needed BC on board to qualify for that. Quebec was out of the picture because it was on another course called Sovereignty Association. So they dropped 34, and we organized in Alberta. There was 5,000 people. We congregated at the Kingsman Fieldhouse. Some of you might remember that march we did. I was demanding a meeting with Premier Lougheed, and he wouldn't grant because he was in favor of dropping 34. So I protested, a silent protest. Matter of fact, Muriel helped me that time. I burned sweetgrass on the south side of the ledge every morning at 7. And then on the 5th day, I went on a CBC. I was very much involved in holding news conferences, given interviews, etc. So I went on CBC Radio, 8 o'clock that morning, and Lougheed phoned me and said, we got to have a meeting. And we said, yeah, for sure. So, but anyways, at the national level with the Native Council of Canada, it was going through political change too. And it just so happened, like, preceding, after 1982, there were conferences that were starting to happen to trying to discuss Aboriginal rights, trying to define them. So the Native Council of Canada went through its political change. When who got elected was, and during that time, 2 seats were allotted to the Indian, 2 to the Inuit, and 2 to the Métis, to sit with the other First Ministers around the constitutional table. And Native Council of Canada ended up with a non-status president and a non-status vice president, and they were going to occupy the 2 Métis seats. So that left Métis outside of the constitutional process, and what I thought, it was time for a divorce. It was time that the Métis started their own organization. We initially called it the Métis Alliance. Don McIver was the president of Manitoba Métis Federation. He was on board. Alberta Sam Sinclair wasn't quite on board yet, but who eventually came on board was Jim Sinclair. And that was the birth of the Métis National Council. And that truly represented the Métis at the constitutional talks preceding Section 35. So Métis occupied the 2 Métis seats. As a matter of fact, we had to take the Secretary of State to court to make sure that those seats were Métis. So that's some of the history behind that.
Yeah, I just want to say something. I don't know. I don't understand courts and stuff. And I don't like them. I think that they divide us all over the place. But I do know that before Harry died, he talked a lot about treaties, and I know that from my own research over the last 150 years, there have been treaties between First Nations people and Métis people. You know, probably the most well-known one is the Iron Treaty. And I know that I spent a lot of time with Malcolm Norris, and he used to talk about, about working together, but not so much that we were one people to recognize our differences, but that we be able to support each other as Indigenous people on issues that affected us. And in the mid-1960s, we tried to form a federation. And I don't know how many of you remember that. Maybe Joe remembers it. I don't know if, no, not National Indian Council. It was here in the province. And it was bringing together treaty people, non-status people, and Métis people. And we actually it was registered, and there was an office on 100 Avenue, I think it was. And it didn't last very long, because it was shortly after that the first checks, which were $30,000 each, one that went to Indian Association and one that came to us. I know because I was the one that got the check that we got. And that was the end of any kind of federation. And at the time when Stan and old John Sampson and other people were organizing that was what they wanted to do. We didn't have much money, a whole lot of us. We didn't have a lot of power. And so by coming together and sharing what money we had so that we could share our field staff and go out into the field and talk to our people, that we could support each other on issues, again, that were important to us, things like housing and whatever. But the $30,000 that we each got totally divided us. That never happened again. I believe that Métis people have to be alone in an organization, just like I believe that non-status people have to organize and speak for themselves. And I've never understood how come Congress hasn't done that, got out there and fought for them. And And I also believe that's true of First Nations people. But I also believe that there's some things today, like the horrific suicides in our communities, the missing and murdered women, those are things that we should all be standing up together on and speaking against them, not all of us in our own corners talking to protect that. Our children are in care. We have more kids in care now than we ever had at any other time in our history, which says that, you know, as leaders in this country, everybody is focusing on everything except what's happening to their children and what's happening to their communities. From all the research that I've done, and I've done research that goes back to the 1700s, that was one of the things they had to do. They had to totally break up family units in order for them to be able to deal with Indigenous people in this country. And, you know, when we look at what's happening all around us, it's really worked. You know, as long as we don't have land, and as long as we're fighting with each other, it means that all of our resources can get carted away and all that money is going to somebody else, and there's not a penny of it that's going to our own people. And I hope that with all of the young people that are here who are going to school, I think you're all wonderful. You know, sometimes I get a bit crazy at some of the things that you say and write about, but I totally support what you're doing. But I wish you'd look at other things as well. You know, who's looking at the really contemporary history about road allowances? Who's looking at what's happened in our communities over the last 50 years? You know, those are the areas that have to be researched. Everybody can go and dig around and, you know, in all of the stuff that old white guys wrote or, you know, what papers you can find. But you also need to look at history today. People like Tony, Joe Blind, who's just full of all kinds of information, like Murray Hamilton, you shake him and all these stories come out. Tony's got all of these stories, you know, that have to do with politics and with leadership. You don't have to agree with those things, but those are things that have to go into our archives, and there are things that have to go to young leadership so that they've got a road to follow. The only road right now we've got to follow is everybody fighting and constantly running to court, taking each other to court. We spend so much money on lawyers and taking each other to court that it just makes you crazy. You know, we could have bought our land by now. So to Chris, I have to apologize to Chris, who's my nephew. I'm sorry I was cussing. I just realized that. I always told him never to cuss when he's speaking. But I also want to say to him and to Brenda and Adam and all of you who are here, you know, don't leave out that early history, because once people like us are gone, that's it. There's, you know, we'll have no record of that. We were lucky we had people like Adrian Hope and old Henry Thompson to make sure that we had those stories. And you got lots of time to work on that other stuff. And there's nothing wrong with being Red River Métis. You know, half of my family are Red River Métis, but I also have half of my family who are not, and they were also Métis people. I don't even like the word Métis. Do you know that we never started using Métis until the 1960s? And I remember having big fighting matches in halls all over this province when government told us we had to call ourselves Métis because they didn't like the word half-breed, and everybody kept saying Michif or mischief instead of Michif. And so my father, for one, said, I'm no goddamn Métis. Nobody's going to call me that. I'm a half-breed. And there were other old people that said, we're not half-breeds. Why does government have to come here and tell us what we have to do in order for us to get a little bit of money? I just wish for once we would just do what we have to do, look after our kids, make a road for them, and get us some bloody land. And for me, that's what Harry was working on when we can't, you know, Riel said, you have to land on ground. And as long as we were Métis people, we didn't have, I think that's what elders were trying to tell us when we were young, when my dad would say, I'm an Indian and I'm a half-breed. Being an Indian meant that we were of this land, and I believe that, and I don't know a lot about law, but I believe that's what the Daniel case does, is it says that we are now Indians. There were First Nations people, and there were Inuit people who were Indians, and now we're Indians too. And there's no bloody reason why new leadership coming along can't go out there and get that land if it means negotiating treaties.
Gabriel, you had, and then there's Tony, and then I'll take a last question, and then we'll have to go for a little break.
I'll be quick. I just want to, Kim, yes, the non-status hasn't been mentioned much, but that's kind of the message I think we're all agree on, is that no one should be left out, and that's what I loved about this case, is that no one is left out. So, but I think all of us, we need to be thinking in those terms of it's all of us, because if we're not united, like south of the border, like stuff's happening so fast. We're running out of time. We can't be sitting around pointing fingers at each other and saying, I'm more than you are, or whatever. Or you don't come from this part of the country. We don't have time for this anymore. We got to get organized. We got to start talking. And just to say, yeah, non-status for sure, man. Absolutely.
Tony?
As Maria was talking, I was thinking to myself, well, we need a new terminology. Didn't like, never used Métis. We used Apitago-San, Nehio, half-breed, status Indian, non-status Indian. Let's just all call ourselves 9124 Indians.
So we'll take the last question. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Gary Bailey. I'm here from the Northwest Territories. I'm the president of the Northwest Territory Métis Nation. I'd like to thank you for welcoming us. I did bring a delegation from our three communities. We have been negotiating a land claim since 1996. It's good to hear all the things that you're talking about because, we talk about Métis, Indians, and Inuit, and non-status. We've been negotiating as Métis. We self-identify as one of the Aboriginal people of Canada with Chippewa, Cree, and Slavey descent. We recognize our ancestry, but we are one of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada as a Métis person. So that's how we've gotten to where we've gotten. We are negotiating land, resources. And it's very tricky dealing with the government. The main thing that we're here for right now is to talk about programs and services. But 1982 to Section 35, it was a big win. We were recognized as a people with rights. It goes back to the Royal Proclamation. You're an Aboriginal person with rights. Now you see the government they've been trying to water those rights down as far as they can, and they've done that. Like the Harry Daniels case is limited to programs and services, but it was more. So we won halfway. The fight's going to go on a lot further, but how we get land, like I said, we identify as one of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, and within that definition includes Métis. So we're getting there. We're actually have an offer on the table. It's not good for us. It's always a battle. They're trying to take it now. But you guys got to keep going with these fights so we can always catch up and someday have equal rights. We talk about non-status and treaties. And, we're all the same people. We were here before government. Government wants sovereignty amongst our people. We are one of those people as rights-bearing people before the, since the Royal Proclamation came up, since pre-government control, we're there. We talk about now we're recognized as Indians under the Constitution for programs and services. Some Métis are not happy because it uses the word Indians. We just said, well, we got to negotiate modern treaties. We have to. We're never going to get more than the First Nations either. It's how you get there. I too traveled, been doing this for 20 years of my life. I was very fortunate. I got to meet your father. He was cool, He was, I swear, he was just like he was one of our own people from our territory. He had a car, he had all the red velvet, not velvet, but red material with those little balls around your car, you know, and open up the trunk and he had just nothing but 8-track tapes all just scattered there. Had rings on every finger, gold necklace, cowboy hat. He was pretty cool. I thought he was awesome back then. He looked just like my uncles too. So, you know, we're all one people. My daughter, she was, like, I always talk to my kids about this stuff. She was 4 years old, I always talk to her, you know, about my mom. She's a Treaty Indian, Bill C-31. You know, grandmother was forced to marry a French Métis, but he was really Northwest Territory Métis because Francois Beaulieu, like we all have a patriarch, Louis Riel, Red River, ours is Francois Beaulieu. Came from Quebec as well, but went through Red River, come into our territory. They had a baby with one of the First Nations, Catherine. They named him Francois. Well, that was our patriarch, you know. He's a Métis. I don't know, call him non-status, what do you call him? What do you call him? He's the same. We were there before government anyways. You know, so I always tell my daughter that story, and, you know, we're different. My mother lost her rights because my grandmother was forced to marry my grandfather who wasn't an Indian, and so on, but my mom got her rights back as a Bill C-31. So what are we, asked my daughter. 4 years old, she said, we should be called a Métis Indian. At 4 years old, she understood it. Government's been playing this game with us forever, divide and conquer. You know, we have people opposing us thinking, you know, well, you're not Métis, you're an Indian, negotiating as an Indian, not a Métis. I'm not, I'm proud Métis. They given me that name, I didn't ask to be a Métis. You know, half-breeds was what we were, like you say, free people. We like that, but they come up with Métis, so we live with it. And I'm now a proud Métis, I can't go backwards. We've come a long way, so let's throw that out there a little bit, a little history about who we are, like we've never been to these before. We're not part of the MNC, so we really don't have no representation at that level with Ottawa. We have to fight to get there. We've got to kind of burst our way into meetings. It's kind of like what we're doing here. But it's good to hear that, you know, people are saying that we're all one. Whether you're tied to Louis Riel or Red River or not. I mean, bottom line, we are Métis people. And we aren't defined. That's true. So my daughter, who was 4 years old, said we were Métis Indian. I mean, she was 4 years old. It's pretty easy to figure out that we all have the same goals and stuff like that. So I'd just like to, again, thank your family as well for all the years that they've put in, and as well yourselves for all the hard work that you guys have done to get us this far. I mean, we didn't get to where we are now. We used the Constitution, the Royal Proclamation, all the stuff that you guys have worked to get us recognized in. So thank you for that.
Thank you. So we should give a big round of applause for our 4 participants. And we'll take a 10-15 minute break, and then we'll start the other panel. Thank you.